In the last year of the war, Hogwarts belonged to the Death Eaters, and a price had been set on a child who had done nothing but be born to the wrong parents. This is not a story about a battle, it is a story about the people who quietly refused. Miriam Vale found the blood on the third-floor landing just after evening roll call. 3 small drops beside the plinth where a suit of armor had once stood, dark against the pale stone. They'd taken the armor away in September, after it clipped one of the Carrows with its own halberd, and a square of cleaner stone still marked the place where its feet had rested for centuries. She stopped, her patrol list folded in one hand. Behind her, the corridor was empty, though voices carried up from the staircase below, where the students were being counted again outside the Great Hall. 2 second years had come back late from the library. She lowered herself beside the first drop and touched the edge of it with one finger. It had not dried. A faint smear led off towards the hospital wing. Whoever left it had kept close to the wall, passing behind the row of narrow windows, and beneath the portrait of a sleeping shepherd whose painted dog watched Miriam without moving its head. Since the new headmaster had ordered the portraits to report suspicious activity, most of them had grown careful about what they let themselves notice. She drew her wand and cleaned the first 3 drops. The spell left a wet shine on the stone, too bright beneath the torches, so she scuffed the place with the sole of her shoe until dust dulled it again. A little farther along, she found another mark on the skirting board and wiped it away with her sleeve. Her yellow prefect's badge caught the light each time she bent. The hospital wing doors were locked. Madame Pomfrey had been ordered to close at 7 now, unless a member of staff brought the injured student in person, and a notice fixed to the door listed the new rules in narrow black writing. Someone had added a 5th line beneath them in red ink. Unauthorized treatment will be considered assistance to enemies of the school. The blood trail ended under the notice. Miriam listened, then knocked once. Nothing moved inside. She knocked again, using the old pattern from the previous year, from when prefects had fetched fever drafts after curfew. Twice, a pause, then once more. A bolt shifted on the other side, and Madame Pomfrey opened the door no wider than the length of her hand. What is it? There's blood in the corridor. Madame Pomfrey looked past her. Her face had grown thinner since September, and loose strands of gray hair had escaped her cap. Whose? I don't know. Then you found nothing. The door began to close, and Miriam put 2 fingers against its edge before she'd quite decided to. Madame Pomfrey's eyes dropped to the hand, then came back to her face. There was enough to leave a trail, Miriam said. For several seconds, neither of them moved. From the floor below came the crack of a curse, then the sound of something heavy striking a wall. The matron opened the door and stepped aside. Most of the beds had been stripped, the white curtains tied back. The cabinets of stronger potions clapped in iron locks around their handles. Only one bed remained made at the far end of the ward, beneath the window, though no patient lay in it. On the floor beside it stood a basin, the water inside faintly pink. Madame Pomfrey walked past the bed without looking at it. Show me your patrol list. Miriam handed it over. The matron read down the names, then set one finger against the final line. You are due on the 4th floor in 6 minutes. Yes. You will be there. Miriam was looking at the pink water. A strip of bloodied linen had been pushed under the cabinet, not quite out of sight, and beside it lay a shirt button of pale blue plastic, the sort sold in Muggle shops, flat and cheap, 4 holes through the center. Madame Pomfrey folded the patrol list and gave it back. The corridor was clean when you passed. Yes. You did not enter this ward. No. A sound came from behind the linen cupboard, no louder than a shoe shifting on stone. Miriam turned her head before she could stop herself. The cupboard stood against the oldest wall of the hospital wing, broad enough to hold folded sheets from floor to ceiling, and its lower door hung open by an inch. Madame Pomfrey crossed the room and shut it with her hip. A bottle fell earlier. Miriam said nothing. Go, the matron told her. She reached the door before the sound came again, followed this time by a breath drawn sharply through the teeth. Her hand went still on the latch. Behind her, Madame Pomfrey stayed beside the cupboard, one palm pressed flat against its wooden door. Is he badly hurt? Miriam asked. Nothing in the matron's face changed. You are already late. Boots sounded in the corridor outside. A turn of her wand, and Madame Pomfrey had the lamps out. The ward dropped into a gray half-light from the windows. She caught Miriam by the sleeve and pulled her behind the open door just as someone struck it from the other side. Miriam Vale, called a man's voice. Open this door. Amicus Carrow knocked again, slowly. Miriam felt the matron release her sleeve, and in the dimness, Madame Pomfrey took the bloodied linen from beneath the cabinet and pressed it into Miriam's hand. Then she lifted the basin of pink water and carried it towards the nearest empty bed. The knocking stopped. Miriam tucked the linen inside her robe, drew back the bolt, and opened the door. Carrows stood there with 2 Slytherin prefects behind him, his wand resting against the center of his palm. He looked first at Miriam, then at Madame Pomfrey, who had begun washing an unused bed frame as though they had interrupted her halfway through it. What are you doing here? He asked. Miriam held out her patrol list. Checking the locked doors, Professor. You're late for the 4th floor. Yes, Professor. His eyes moved to her cuff where a narrow red stain had soaked through, the linen pressed against her wrist. She folded her arms and covered it with one hand. Carrows stepped closer. Something wrong? No, Professor. Behind them, the sleeping shepherd's dog began to bark inside its frame. All 3 men turned towards the portrait, where the dog ran in frantic circles while the shepherd slept on beneath his painted tree. Carrows swore and strode out to silence it. Miriam closed the hospital wing door, slid the bolt into place, and kept her hand against it until the footsteps had passed. By the time she reached the 4th floor, the roll call bell had stopped. The corridor lamps had been lowered, and wide stretches of stone lay in shadow. 2 Ravenclaw girls stood facing the wall outside an empty classroom, their hands flat against the cold blocks above their heads, and a Slytherin prefect leaned on the opposite windowsill and watched her approach. You're late, he said. Hospital wing door was unsecured. He glanced at the list in her hand. Was it? It is secured now. The boy pushed himself upright. Selwyn, his name was, though he was no relation to the family whose name hung beside the new headmaster's office. He had started the year trying to keep out of the Carrows' way, and ended up carrying messages for them, and a bruise showed beneath one eye, yellow at the edges. "Carrow was looking for you," he said. "He found me." Selwyn looked at the girls by the wall. These two were whispering during the count. Neither girl moved. One had begun to tremble in the arms, though she kept her palms in place. Miriam marked their names on the patrol sheet, then drew a line through the box for further punishment. "They have been recorded," she said. Selwyn's eyes stayed on the crossed-out box. "That isn't what I told you to write." "You told me why they were here." "I told you to send them down." She folded the sheet once and put it into her pocket. "Your section ends at the west stairs." For a moment he looked ready to call her back. Instead, he stepped away from the windowsill and walked past her, the soles of his shoes striking hard on the stone. He did not look at the girls as he went. Miriam waited until his footsteps had faded. "Lower your arms." The girls turned slowly. One had tears across her face. The other rubbed at her shoulders and stared at the floor. "Back to your dormitory," Miriam said. "Will he check?" the tearful girl asked. "Go." They left without another word. The bloodied linen still pressed against Miriam's wrist beneath her sleeve, cooling now, though the skin under it burned. She slipped into the nearest washroom, locked the door, and unfolded the cloth over a basin. Blood had soaked through several layers. A few short hairs clung to one edge, dark brown, cut roughly with scissors, and near the center sat a sharp smear of green paste that smelled of dittany and nettles. She turned on the tap. The pipes coughed before a thin stream of brown water appeared, and she held the linen beneath it until the blood loosened and curled away in pale threads. When the cloth was mostly clean, she twisted it tight and pushed it behind the cracked cistern where damp rags and broken quills had collected over the years. A noise in the corridor. She shut off the water and listened as someone tried the handle once, then again with more force. "Occupied," she said. No answer came. Wand drawn, she stood beside the door and waited. The handle stopped moving, and after a few seconds, the footsteps retreated towards the staircase. Only when she could no longer hear them did she leave the washroom and resume her patrol. The fourth floor had changed. Since the previous year, 2 suits of armor were gone, along with the long tapestry of trolls dancing around a cauldron. The stone behind it showed pale where the fabric had shielded the wall from smoke and dust. Every portrait had been turned to face the corridor now so that none could pretend to sleep with its face to the frame. At the far end, the fat friar hovered beside a locked classroom, hands folded inside his sleeves. He watched Miriam approach, then moved aside without greeting her. "What is it?" she asked. His only answer was a glance towards the nearest portrait, a narrow-faced witch holding a silver cup. Miriam lowered her voice and asked again what had happened. The ghost drifted closer to the wall. "There was someone here before curfew." "Who?" "I could not see." The narrow-faced witch raised her cup. "A boy," she said, "filthy robes, limping." When Miriam turned towards her, the witch went on, unhurried. He'd gone towards the hospital wing, and she had reported it. The fat friar closed his eyes. "To whom?" Miriam asked. And the witch smiled faintly and said only that she had reported it to whom one reports such things. A door opened on the staircase below. Voices rose, then the scrape of several pairs of boots. Miriam stepped between the portrait and the corridor. Which direction was he limping? The witch's smile widened. You have already asked enough. The search party reached the landing. Amicus Carrow appeared first with Selwyn and two older students behind him, one carrying a lantern, the other a length of chain. Carrow stopped when he saw Miriam. Still checking doors? Yes, Professor. What did the portrait tell you? Miriam looked back at the witch, whose painted eyes were bright with expectation. She said a student was out after curfew. Which way? She unfolded her patrol list. Towards the north stairs. The fat friar lowered his head. Carrow glanced along the corridor. The north stairs led away from the hospital wing, towards classrooms sealed since Christmas, and he looked at Miriam for several seconds before turning to the others. North, he said. The group moved past her. Selwyn came last, and as he drew level, his gaze dropped to the damp cuff of Miriam's robe, then lifted to her face. He said nothing. When the footsteps had gone, she walked to the portrait and lifted it from the wall. The narrow-faced witch shouted as the frame tipped forward in her hands. You cannot do that. But Miriam carried it into the locked classroom beside the fat friar, leaned it face first against the floor, closed the door, and turned the key. The friar remained in the corridor. You should go, she said. He gave a small nod and drifted through the wall. Before leaving, Miriam took the piece of chalk from her pocket and drew a short white line beside the classroom door, the mark prefects once used to show that a room had been searched. Then she added a second line beneath it. She did not return to the hospital wing until after midnight. The Hufflepuff dormitory had gone quiet, though few people were sleeping. Curtains shifted as she crossed the room, and someone whispered her name from behind a closed bed. She took a clean shirt from her trunk, folded it under her robe, and left without answering. The corridors below the kitchens smelled of ash and boiled cabbage. Most of the House-elves had been ordered away from the upper floors after food began disappearing from the serving tables, and two iron grills now blocked the passages leading to their quarters. Miriam followed the wall until she reached a narrow cupboard where old brooms were kept. Inside waited a house elf, smaller than most, one ear folded forward and a strip of sacking tied around his waist. His bare feet rested in a shallow puddle from a leaking pipe. When she opened the door, he raised both hands as though expecting a blow. You're Pip, she said. He nodded quickly. Pip was told the prefect would come. Who told you? Madam did. Is he still bleeding? Pip glanced along the corridor before answering. Less now. The cut opened when he climbed. Miriam stepped into the cupboard and pulled the door nearly shut behind her, the broom handles pressing against her shoulder. Pip held a small wooden bowl covered with a cloth, and beneath it a stoppered bottle no larger than his thumb. What happened to him? He fell from a moving stair? He could not call out. Why was he on the third floor? The elf twisted the edge of his sacking between his fingers. The room below the owlery was found. She had heard about that room. A stack of blankets had been discovered there 3 days earlier, together with a Muggle newspaper and the remains of 2 meals, and 3 students had been questioned in the Great Hall afterwards. One had returned to his dormitory with his wand hand bound against his chest. Who else knows where he is now? Madam knows. Pip knows. And me? Pip lowered his eyes. From beyond the door came the dragging sound of metal over stone. Miriam pushed the cupboard shut, leaving only a thin gap beside the hinges. A lantern passed along the corridor, followed by a caretaker's trolley carrying chains, confiscated books, and several broken wands. And Argus Filch walked behind it with his keys knocking against his leg. Mrs. Norris stopped outside the cupboard. Her nose moved against the lower edge of the door. Pip drew his feet back from the light, and Miriam kept one hand over the clean shirt beneath her robe and the other around her wand. Filch gave the trolley a sharp pull. "Come on." The cat remained where she was. A thin mewing sound came from the kitchens. At once, Mrs. Norris turned and slipped beneath the nearest grill, and Filch muttered and followed her, leaving the trolley standing in the corridor. Pip let out his breath through his nose. Mallow does that sound well. Mallow? Kitchen cat, miss. Not a proper cat. He opened the cupboard door and peered out. Miriam followed him past the abandoned trolley, keeping close to the wall, and they reached the servant's stair beside the old pantry and climbed without speaking. At the second landing, Pip stopped beneath a narrow stone arch. A tapestry had once covered the wall there, though only 3 rusted hooks remained. He pressed 2 fingers into a crack between the stones and whispered something too softly for Miriam to hear. A section of wall shifted inward. Behind it lay a passage no wider than a cupboard, low steps descending into darkness. Dust covered the floor except for a line of small bare footprints and the deeper marks of someone dragging one leg. Miriam looked back towards the stair. "Does this open from the other side?" Pip shook his head. "Only here." "Who built it?" Pip does not know. "Who else uses it?" The elf's face tightened. "No one reports this passage." Miriam entered first. The air inside was stale and carried the dry smell of old linen. Pip closed the wall behind them and the last of the corridor light vanished. They moved by the weak glow of Miriam's wand. The steps descended beneath the hospital wing, turned twice, and ended at a wooden panel. Pip tapped it once with his knuckles, and someone tapped back. The panel opened into a room packed with folded sheets, cracked bedpans, and boxes of empty potion bottles. Daniel Price sat on the floor between 2 cabinets, a bandage circling his head, his right trouser leg cut open from knee to ankle. He was holding a piece of broken glass when Miriam came in. Pip raised the bowl between them. "Food." Daniel didn't let go of the glass. Gray beneath the freckles, one side of his hair shorn away around a stitched wound. He looked first at the prefect badge on her chest, and only then at her face. "Who is she?" "Miriam Vale," Pip said, and when that plainly wasn't enough, added, "She cleaned the blood." Daniel's fingers loosened a little. Miriam set the folded shirt on the floor and pushed it towards him with the toe of her shoe. "You left a trail from the landing?" "I know." Carrow found the hospital wing. She watched him take that in. His eyes went to the closed panel behind her, and he said he needed to move. "Not tonight," she told him. When he insisted they would search the storeroom again, she shook her head. They were searching the north stairs. His eyes stayed on her. "Why?" "Because I told them to. You know, For a while, nobody spoke. Somewhere above, a bed dragged across the hospital floor, faint through the stone. Daniel lowered the broken glass, but kept it in his fist. She crouched beside his injured leg, clean bandage at the knee, dark near the calf. When she reached for it, he caught her wrist and asked whether she was going to report him. No, she said. He wanted to know why not. She only looked at his hand until he let go, and then she started working the blood-stiffened knot loose. Hold the lamp. The cut ran along the outside of his calf, deep enough that the skin drew apart whenever he moved. Madame Pomfrey had closed most of it, but 3 stitches near the ankle had torn free. Miriam washed her hands from the bottle Pip carried and pressed a clean cloth against the wound. Daniel's jaw set. He stared at the cabinet behind her, both hands flat on the floor. Whenever footsteps crossed the ward overhead, Pip dropped the wand light low and cupped a palm around it. Did you fall from the stair? It moved while I was crossing. They do that? Someone called my name. Her hand stopped. Who? I didn't see. Pip put down the covered bowl and drew a narrow tin from inside his sacking, its lid stamped with the faded crest of St. Mungo's. A curved needle lay inside. Black thread, 2 small squares of folded gauze. Madam says 3 stitches, he whispered. At home she had mended torn sleeves and split hems. She'd never yet put a needle through living skin. Daniel saw how she held it and reached for the tin. Give it here. You can't see the angle. I can feel it. That is not the same. He looked at her a moment longer, then leaned back against the cabinet and let her be. Pip poured a little clear liquid over the needle, and the smell of it filled the room, sharp and medicinal. She pushed the point through beside the first torn stitch. Daniel's heel scraped once across the floor. She drew the thread through, tied it the way Madame Pomfrey had shown the first years during emergency training, and cut the end with the small scissors from the tin. The second went in crooked, so she took it out and started over. Sweat had gathered along his upper lip, though the storeroom stayed cold. Where were you hiding before the owlery? Different places. Which places? He shook his head. When she said she needed to know which passages might already be watched, he told her she needed to know less. Pip's ears lowered. Miriam pulled the 3rd stitch tight and knotted it, and Daniel kept his eyes shut until she'd finished winding fresh bandage around his ankle. The bowl held thin soup, a heel of bread, half a boiled potato. He ate slowly, stopping each time the floorboards above creaked while she gathered the bloodied cloths into the empty St. Mungo's tin and pressed the lid down. How long have you been here? In the school? In hiding? Since October. She looked at him. She'd seen his name on the missing student list in the entrance hall, and later on a ministry notice outside the Great Hall, that he had fled Hogwarts and was thought to be traveling on forged papers. People thought you were gone, she said. That was the idea. A bell sounded somewhere in the castle. Once a pause, then twice more. Pip stood so fast the bowl went over. Inspection bell, he said, before she could even ask. And when she said which floor, all floors. Daniel pushed himself up against the cabinet. His injured foot met the stone and folded under him, and Miriam caught his arm before he went down. Above them, several doors opened one after another. A man was ordering patients out of bed. though the ward had no patience in it. Another voice demanded keys. Pip laid his ear to the wooden panel. "They are in the passage." She crossed the storeroom and put out her wand. The dark closed in. Daniel's sleeve was still bunched in her hand, the fabric damp under her fingers. The panel shook once in its frame. A hand struck it flat from the far side, and dust came down off the top edge and settled through her hair. Daniel raised the broken glass again. "Locked," said a voice beyond the wood. "There should not be a door here," another answered. Metal scraped at the latch. Miriam felt along the wall until her hand closed on the handle of a tall linen press, hauled it open, pulled out 2 bundles of sheets, and pushed Daniel towards the gap. He balked when he saw how narrow it was. "I won't fit." "You will." "My leg." "Put your weight on me." He did, and she took most of it across her shoulder while Pip lifted the injured foot, and between them they folded him in among the shelves of rough linen and closed the doors to a finger's width. The latch gave. Madame Pomfrey came in first with a lamp. Amicus Carrow followed, Selwyn at his back, and a second prefect Miriam didn't know. The matron stopped at the sight of her beside the open cabinet. "What are you doing here?" Carrow asked. She held up the St. Mungo's tin. "Collecting discarded dressings." "At this hour?" Madame Pomfrey said the storeroom was to be cleared. Carrow turned to the matron. Her eyes went over the overturned bowl, the bundled sheets, the faint wet mark where Daniel's heel had dragged. "I said tomorrow morning," she replied. Miriam did not turn towards her. Carrow stepped further in. The lamp caught a dark splash of soup on the floor and a piece of bread beneath the cabinet, and he lifted the bread between 2 fingers. "Rats?" Madame Pomfrey took it from him and dropped it into the bowl. "House-elves." Pip bowed until his forehead touched the floor, hands shaking against the stone. Carrow walked to the linen press. Miriam shifted once, so that she stood between him and the doors, and he came close enough that she could smell smoke on his robes. "Move," he said. She lowered her eyes and stepped aside. But before his hand reached the handles, Madame Pomfrey let the lamp fall. Glass burst across the floor. Flame caught the spilled soup and stood up blue for an instant before it ran under the cabinet with a low rush. The second prefect shouted and stumbled back into Selwyn. Madame Pomfrey stamped at the fire with her skirt. "Water," she said, "unless the school now prefers to burn its own hospital." Carrow swore and brought up his wand. By the time the flames were down, the room was full of smoke, and one edge of the linen press had blackened. He left without opening it. Selwyn stayed by the panel a moment after the rest had gone. His gaze moved from Miriam to the press, then down to the fresh bandage thread lying near her shoe. She covered it with her foot. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, and followed Carrow out into the passage. The smoke stayed on in the storeroom after the footsteps had faded. Miriam waited by the linen press, counting slow until the passage beyond the panel went quiet and Pip stayed on his knees with both hands clamped over his mouth. "Daniel," she whispered. The cupboard doors parted an inch. His face showed between the folded sheets, pale, wet with sweat. His injured leg had twisted under him, and when she helped him out, he could not set the foot down at all. Madame Pomfrey came back alone. She shut the panel behind her, put a fresh lamp on the cabinet, soot on the hem of her apron, and knelt beside Daniel, without a word, to cut away the bandage Miriam had tied. "You put weight on it. They came in. I can see that." Daniel looked towards Miriam. "She stitched it." The matron examined the wound. One of the new stitches had torn loose, and blood was beginning to pool beneath the others. Her mouth tightened, though her hands stayed steady. "The first was too close to the edge," she said. "I know," Miriam replied. "No, you know now." Madame Pomfrey drew out the damaged thread and stitched the wound again, while Daniel gripped the side of the cabinet until his knuckles whitened. Behind them, Pip gathered the burned sheets and folded them into a neat pile, though several had holes clean through the middle. Miriam asked what Selwyn had meant, and the matron answered without looking up. He meant that they would search this room tomorrow. "He knew," Miriam said. "He suspects," came the reply. But he had seen the thread. He had seen many things this year. The needle passed through Daniel's skin. He drew one sharp breath and held it. Madame Pomfrey tied off the final knot and wrapped his leg from ankle to knee. "We move him now," Miriam said. "No, the corridors are full, and they will only be worse after dawn." She fastened the bandage with 2 small pins. "He cannot walk." "He did not walk here." "Aquamators," Daniel pushed himself upright. "I can manage." One hand against his chest forced him back down with almost no effort. "You can barely sit," the matron said. Pip carried the charred linen towards a wooden bin and offered to take him. Pip could manage it, but not through the upper passages, Madame Pomfrey said, and the elf's ears lowered. Miriam's eyes moved over the shelves, the cracked bottles, the narrow panel through which Carrows had entered. The room no longer felt hidden. Soot from the small fire had settled over everything now, over Daniel's blanket and the bowl beside him. "Where else is there?" Cleaning the needle before she answered, Madame Pomfrey said, "Nowhere I can reach tonight." There had been places once, she went on when Miriam pressed her. Students used them, teachers knew. Portraits kept their mouths shut. She replaced the needle in its tin. That was before. Nobody spoke for a while. Above them, a trolley rolled across the hospital ward, the wheels stopping directly overhead before they continued on towards the far beds. Daniel pulled the clean shirt Miriam had brought over his head. It was too large for him, the sleeves swallowing half his hands, and his own shirt lay beside the cabinet, stiff with dried blood. "Who called your name on the stairs?" He rubbed at the edge of one sleeve. "A boy from Ravenclaw," he said. When Miriam asked his name, he told her he didn't know it, and she pointed out that he'd known him well enough to stop. "He said he had food," Daniel answered. The matron turned towards him. "Describe him." "Tall, 6th or 7th year, dark hair." "That describes half the school," Miriam said. "He wore a blue prefect's badge." Pip stopped folding. Miriam thought of the 2 Ravenclaw girls on the 4th floor, their hands flat against the wall. Had he seen where Daniel went after the fall, she asked, and when he looked down at the floor, she asked again. "He had stunned the boy," he said at last. Madame Pomfrey's face hardened. "Where?" "Behind the tapestry near the charms corridor." "And left him there?" "I heard people coming." For a moment, Miriam shut her eyes. The tapestry had been taken down weeks ago. There was no cover left in that corridor now, only bare stone and portraits turned outward. "He may have been found," she said. "He would have told them already," Daniel answered, and she said that he may have told them enough. Daniel leaned against the cabinet. "I had no choice." Picking up his bloodied shirt, the matron dropped it into the bin with the burned linen. "You had several. None were good." The inspection bell rang again, farther off this time, and Pip flinched at the first note. Miriam crossed to the panel and listened. Voices were moving through the passage beyond it. A door opened, then closed. Someone coughed close to the wall and stayed there for several seconds. "Searchers?" Daniel asked. Miriam raised one hand. From the other side of the panel came a faint scraping. Not a key, not a wand. Chalk against stone. Once the footsteps had retreated, she opened the panel a fraction and looked into the passage. A white cross had been drawn beside the frame at shoulder height. Selwyn's mark. She rubbed at it with her thumb, and the chalk only smeared across the stone. Pip handed her the corner of his sacking, and she scrubbed until nothing was left but a pale stain. "They know there is something here," Daniel said. "They know there is a room. That is enough." Miriam closed the panel and turned to face Madame Pomfrey. "There was a chamber above the old kitchens," she said. The matron shook her head. The stair was blocked, only from the main corridor, Miriam told her, and when the matron asked how she could know that, she said she had hidden there during first year. Daniel watched her. "From what?" She let the question pass. "There is a service shaft behind the flower store. It reaches the room from below." "It had not been opened in years," Madame Pomfrey said. "It had opened then," Miriam answered. "You were 11, the matron said, and Miriam told her the wall had not grown. Pip stood very still beside the bin. "Pip knows the flower store." Madame Pomfrey looked from the elf to Daniel's leg and said he could not climb a shaft. "He wouldn't have to," Miriam told her. "Oh, there was an old dumbwaiter. The ropes would have rotted," the matron said. "Then they would replace them." "With what?" Miriam's eyes went to the stacks of linen surrounding them, and the matron followed the look. "Sheets tear," she said. "Not if they are braided." A door slammed in the hospital ward above. Amicus Carrows' voice carried down through the floor, ordering every cabinet opened before breakfast. Madame Pomfrey put out the lamp. In the dark, Miriam heard her pull a bundle of clean sheets from the nearest shelf. 3 lengths, the matron said, torn from top to bottom. "Oui." Pip began separating the linen by touch, and Daniel dragged himself closer and took one edge between his hands. Miriam sat opposite him on the stone floor. Together they twisted the first strip until it tightened into a rough white cord, and they worked on until the sheet strips hardened beneath their palms. Madame Pomfrey twisting each length, Miriam holding the tension, Daniel binding the ends with thread taken from the dressing tin. Pip moved between them, knotting the joins with small, quick fingers. In the end, the finished rope lay across the floor in pale coils, thick as Miriam's wrist. At 2:30, the hospital clock struck once and stopped. Its mechanism had been damaged during a search in November, and it had not kept proper time since. Madame Pomfrey listened to the ward above her for a moment, then opened the panel. "The lower stair should be clear for 10 minutes, she said. "Should be?" Daniel asked. "It was clear when I looked." Miriam wound the rope around her body beneath her robe. Its weight dragged at her shoulders and made the front of the garment hang badly. Pip wrapped 2 shorter lengths around his own waist and hid them under his sacking. They left the storeroom one at a time. Madame Pomfrey first, carrying a basket of scorched linen, then Pip with the empty soup bowl, then Miriam with Daniel leaning against her side. His arm lay across her shoulders and his injured foot hung above the floor, and each step forced a small breath out of him. At the first turn, his fingers tightened against her collar. "Stop," he whispered. They stood in the dark passage. Overhead, someone crossed the hospital wing and paused near the hidden panel. A cupboard opened. Glass knocked against glass. Madame Pomfrey lifted the basket and went on down the steps. The passage ended behind the old pantry, where a stone door opened beneath a shelf of cracked jars. Miriam looked through first. Outside, the corridor was empty but for Filch's trolley, still standing against the wall. Pip pointed towards it. Keys. A ring of keys hung from the handle beside several lengths of confiscated chain. Miriam eased Daniel against the wall and crossed the corridor. The trolley wheels creaked the moment she touched it, and she waited. Nothing answered from the kitchens. Somewhere beyond the grills, crockery rattled and then fell still. She lifted the keys, worked the shortest chain free, and carried it back to the others. "That will be noticed," Madame Pomfrey said. "Not before morning." "It is morning." Miriam hung the keys back on the handle. "Not before he counts them." They passed beneath the main stair and into the servants' corridor, where the walls drew in close, and soot from the kitchen fires blackened the ceiling. Daniel had begun to drag his good foot. At the first corner, a lamp appeared ahead. Madame Pomfrey hauled open a cupboard and pushed the basket inside. Pip vanished beneath a low bench. Drawing Daniel behind a row of hanging aprons, Miriam held him upright against the wall. Professor Sinistra came round the corner with a stack of astronomy charts in her arms. She stopped. Miriam could see her face through a gap between the aprons. The professor's eyes traveled from the 2 pairs of shoes beneath the hanging cloth to the faint line of blood on the floor behind them, and there she stopped. No one spoke. Sinistra shifted the charts to her other arm. One slipped loose and unrolled across the passage, covering the blood, and she bent to retrieve it, taking longer than she needed to wind the parchment back around its wooden rod. "The east stair is being inspected," she said. Madame Pomfrey stepped out of the cupboard and told her they were going west. The west stair has 2 prefects at the landing. Coming out from behind the aprons, Miriam kept herself between Daniel and the professor. "Was the classroom passage open?" she asked. Sinistra adjusted the edge of the top chart and said it had been locked at supper. "Is it open now?" The professor's gaze went to the dark end of the corridor. "The lock is old." She walked away without looking behind the aprons again, her footsteps fading towards the east stair. Where the dropped chart had lain, it left a clean strip across the dusty floor, exactly where it had covered the blood. Daniel sagged against Miriam and asked who that had been. "Someone late for work." They crossed the corridor to find the classroom passage door shut, a rusted padlock hanging from the latch, split cleanly through one side. Miriam lifted it off and lowered it to the floor before she opened the door. Beyond it lay a disused stairwell filled with old desks. The steps went down towards the kitchens. Every third tread cracked, and Daniel stared into the darkness of it. "You said a service shaft below this." "How far below?" 2 floors. For a moment he shut his eyes. Of course. Miriam shifted his arm more securely across her shoulders and told him to put his foot down only when she said. The descent took longer than the whole passage from the hospital wing had. Madame Pomfrey went ahead, moving desks aside and testing each step with the heel of her shoe, while Pip followed beneath Daniel's injured leg, ready to lift it whenever the stone dropped away. Halfway down, voices came into the stairwell above them. Miriam looked up. Lamplight spread across the ceiling, thin at first, then brighter, and a key turned in the classroom door they had left behind. At the lower landing, Madame Pomfrey found the way blocked by a fallen cupboard. "There is no time," Daniel said. Lowering him onto the step, Miriam pushed the confiscated chain through the cupboard handles and gave the loose end to Pip. "Pull when I lift," she told him. The elf wrapped the chain around both hands. She braced her shoulder against the wood. It shifted an inch, scraping loudly across the landing. The classroom door opened above. She pushed again. The cupboard tilted, caught on the edge of the broken stair, then fell sideways into the darkness below and struck the floor with a crash that shook dust from the walls. "Who's there?" a voice called. Madame Pomfrey caught Daniel beneath one arm, and Miriam took the other, and between them they dragged him through the opening the cupboard had left. Pip pulled the door shut behind them. There was no lock on the lower side, only a narrow iron bolt set into the stone, and Miriam slid it across just as someone reached the landing above. The handle turned. For several seconds the door strained against the bolt, and dust sifted from the frame. Miriam kept one hand pressed flat to the wood. On the floor beside her, Daniel lay breathing. Then a voice from the stairwell said, "Leave it. Filch can open it after breakfast." The handle released. She waited until the light beneath the door had gone before she took her hand away, and when she did, a splinter stayed behind. Driven in beneath the nail, she wrapped the finger in the hem of her sleeve and followed Pip towards the flower store. It lay beyond two low arches and a door swollen in its frame. Pip put his shoulder to it while Miriam lifted the latch, and the wood gave with a dull crack, a row of sacks leaning towards them out of the dark. Madame Pomfrey lowered Daniel to the floor between two bins. His face had gone colorless, and blood showed again beneath the bandage, a narrow line creeping towards his ankle. "You said the room was above us," he whispered. "It is. That sounds very far." Miriam unwound the sheet rope from beneath her robe and told him then not to look down. Behind the largest flower bin stood the dumbwaiter shaft, its square wooden door gray with years of dust, one corner chewed away by mice. She pulled the bin aside with Pip's help, leaving two pale grooves across the floor. The handle would not turn. Madame Pomfrey tried it once, then drew her wand and said, "Move." "No spells," Miriam said. "The kitchens are watched." The matron lowered the wand. Threading the stolen chain through the handle, Miriam wound it around a stone bracket beside the wall and gave the loose end to Pip. They pulled together until the metal fittings groaned and one screw tore free, and the door came open towards them. Inside, the dumbwaiter platform hung several feet below the opening, tilted sharply to one side. Two ropes ran up into the shaft. One had frayed almost through. The other was black with age and grease. Daniel looked at the platform and said it would not hold him. It held food for 300 years. Food does not move. Some of it did. Madame Pomfrey ran the old ropes through her fingers. The left one, she said, would break first. Pip climbed into the opening and lowered himself onto the platform, which dropped half an inch beneath his weight. Crouching beside the pulley housing, he worked at the rusted pins with a bent spoon taken from his sacking. Miriam fed the braided sheet rope into the shaft and asked whether he could replace the old one. Pip can tie it. That was not the question. The elf looked up. Pip can tie it. A bell rang in the corridor outside, and Madame Pomfrey turned towards the door. Kitchen inspection, she said. The voices came almost at once. House-elves being ordered into rows beyond the nearest grill. A man reading names from a list. Pip's name came third. The elf froze on the platform. Go, Miriam said. He shook his head. They would come looking, she told him, but he only glanced at Daniel, then at the new rope in his hands. I can hold it, she said. Miss does not know the knot. Show me once. The name was called again, louder. Pip climbed out of the shaft. He wrapped the new rope around the old one, crossed the ends beneath the pulley line, and drew them into a compact knot while Miriam watched his fingers. Again, she said. He loosened it and repeated the movement more slowly. Outside, the voice called his name a third time. Then he pushed the rope into her hands and ran to the door. And before he left, he rubbed flour across his face and arms. Then he slipped through the gap and closed it behind him. The man in the corridor asked where he had been. Cleaning oven ash, sir? A pause. Show your hands. Miriam stood motionless beside the shaft. Through the door came the soft sound of a slap. Pip did not cry out. Get in line. The inspection went on. Madame Pomfrey went back to Daniel's leg and tightened the bandage, saying they would have to wait. We cannot. They are outside the door. They will search this room when the count is finished. Then we hide him here. Miriam looked around the store. The flour bins were too shallow, the sacks stacked flat against the wall, and the fresh grooves on the floor still showed where they had dragged the largest bin. Daniel followed her gaze and told her to put it back. The shaft will be covered. That is the point. You will still be here. He reached for the edge of the flour sack beside him. Cover me, he said. Madame Pomfrey shook her head. He could not breathe beneath those. One layer. They will prod them. Then put me in the bin. The matron opened the nearest lid. Half full. Daniel began to drag himself towards it, and Miriam caught his arm and said no. Footsteps stopped outside the store. The latch moved once. Madame Pomfrey hauled Daniel behind the open shaft door, while Miriam pushed the flour bin back into place, leaving herself trapped between it and the wall, the loose end of the new rope lying across her shoe. The door opened. Electo Carrow came in with Selwyn and 2 house-elves behind her, flour dust marking the front of her black robes, a narrow switch in one hand. What had happened to the door, she asked. Madame Pomfrey stood beside the sacks. It sticks. Electo's eye went to the torn screw hanging from the dumbwaiter handle. It appears to have resisted. The kitchens are damp. Selwyn's eyes traveled across the floor, taking in the grooves, the coil of sheet rope near Miriam's foot, and the dark stain spreading beneath Daniel's bandage behind the shaft door. Miriam stepped onto the rope. The switch cracked against the side of a flower bin, and the hollow sound carried through the room. Alecto lifted the lid and plunged one hand into the flower, up to the wrist. Anything missing? One of the house-elves lowered his head and said, "No, madam," and she moved on to the next bin. Behind the dumbwaiter door, Daniel shifted his injured leg, and the sole of his shoe scraped the wall. Selwyn coughed. Alecto turned. He bent forward and coughed harder, one hand over his mouth, flour rising around his shoes. The second house elf took up the coughing beside him. "What is wrong with you?" Alecto asked. Selwyn pointed at the open sack beside Madame Pomfrey and said one word: "Mold." There was no mold. Backing towards the doorway, Alecto covered her nose with her sleeve and told them to seal the room and burn the spoiled stores. The house-elves bowed. Selwyn stayed near the threshold, and for a moment he looked directly at Miriam. Then he reached for the door and closed it, and the key turned from the outside. Madame Pomfrey waited until the footsteps had gone before shifting the flower bin again. Daniel slid out from behind the shaft door, one hand pressed against his leg. "He saw me," he said. "Yes." He could have called her back. Miriam picked up the sheet rope. "He may yet." A sudden crack came from the corridor, then Pip's breath catching in his throat as Alecto ordered him to fetch oil for the fire. Miriam tightened the knot around the old dumbwaiter rope and told Daniel to get on the platform. He lowered himself down with both hands gripping the frame, and the wood tilted beneath him and knocked once against the side of the shaft. Miriam held the new rope while Madame Pomfrey steadied his injured leg. "Keep your back against the wall." There is no wall. The side, then. The shaft above them disappeared into darkness, and dust drifted down whenever Daniel moved. He looked up once, then fixed his eyes on Miriam. Pip returned carrying a small oil jar almost as large as his chest, one side of his face already beginning to swell. He set the jar down beside the door and came straight to the pulley, whispering that they were bringing wood. "How long?" "Minutes." Miriam gave him the rope. He checked the knot, pulled it hard, then added another turn around the old line, and the frayed fibers above them creaked. Madame Pomfrey took Daniel's wrist and warned him that if the platform caught, he was not to try to stand. "What should I do?" "Stay still. That seems to be the answer to everything." No one replied. Miriam and Pip pulled together, and the platform rose slowly, scraping against one side of the shaft, while Daniel pressed both palms flat to the boards beneath him. At shoulder height, the old rope gave a sharp report. The platform dropped several inches. Daniel struck the wall with his shoulder and bit down on his sleeve before a sound could escape him, and Madame Pomfrey caught the lower edge and held it while Miriam wound the new rope twice around the stone bracket. "Do not let go," Pip said. "I was not planning to." The elf climbed halfway into the shaft and reached for the damaged line, his fingers working above the pulley where Miriam could not see. Outside the store, someone dragged a crate across the corridor, and Alecto Carrow ordered the house-elves to stack the firewood against the door. Madame Pomfrey looked towards the oil jar. "She means to burn the room." "She said the stores," Miriam replied. "She will not check which side of the door the flames favor." Pip dropped back onto the floor and told them to pull now. The platform rose again. Leaning her full weight against the rope, Miriam felt the rough braid cut through the skin beneath her fingers, while Pip braced both feet against the flour bin and pulled hand over hand. Daniel vanished above the opening, first his face, then his shoulders, then the white shirt Miriam had brought him. His injured foot struck the frame as the platform passed, and he bent forward, gripping the side until it cleared. A key entered the lock. Madame Pomfrey crossed the room and stood beside the door and told them to keep going. The key turned once and stopped. Someone tried again. "Open it," Alecto called. Madame Pomfrey did not answer. Miriam pulled, and the platform scraped farther upwards, then caught. From inside the shaft, Daniel's voice came faintly. It stopped. "What is holding it?" "I cannot see." "Feel along the right side." The door shook under a blow. Daniel shifted above them. Wood groaned, and something small clattered down the shaft. A rusted spoon struck the platform edge and landed near Miriam's foot. "There is a latch," he whispered. "I think it is the upper door." "Push it." "It is above me." "Use your shoulder." Another blow struck the store door, and the swollen wood split near the lock. Madame Pomfrey placed both hands against it. "Now, Mr. Price." Daniel drove himself upwards. The latch gave with a dry crack, a square of darkness opening above him, then a thin line of yellow light. He caught the upper frame and pulled himself from the platform. The rope slackened. Miriam fell backwards into the flour sacks, and Pip released his end before the loose coils could wrap around his arms. The platform swung in the shaft and struck the wall twice. "Daniel?" Madame Pomfrey called. No answer came. The store door split again. Alecto told the House-elves to stand back, and the smell of oil spread through the gap beside the hinges. Miriam climbed to her feet and pulled on the rope. It tightened from above. "He's off," she said. Pip untied the lower knot and drew the new rope through the pulley as quickly as he could, while Madame Pomfrey took the other end and fed it into the shaft. "Leave the platform," Miriam said. "It will show how he went. So will the rope. Rope can be burned." Outside wood struck wood, and the center panel of the door broke inward as a hand reached through towards the latch. Miriam lifted the oil jar and poured it across the flour near the opposite wall. Madame Pomfrey stared at her. "What are you doing?" "Giving them what they expect." Pip pulled the last length of rope free, and Miriam pushed it into the spilled oil, then tipped the lamp from the shelf. Flame ran across the floor in a low, bright line. The house-elves outside cried out. The hand withdrew from the broken panel, and smoke rose at once, thickened by flour dust and old wood. Madame Pomfrey covered her mouth with her sleeve. The back wall. Together they pulled Daniel's platform clear of the shaft and dragged it towards the fire, and the boards caught slowly at first, then all at once. Alecto shouted for water. Behind the largest flour bin, Madame Pomfrey opened a narrow hatch Miriam had not seen, and cold air came in from a drain passage beyond it. "Go," the matron said. Pip slipped through first, Miriam followed on her knees, and Madame Pomfrey came last and pulled the hatch shut behind them. They crawled beneath the kitchens while water thundered into the store overhead. The passage was too low to stand in, and black water soaked Miriam's robe from the knees down. At the first junction, Pip stopped. "Daniel is alone," he said. Miriam listened to the fire above them and to the shouts, moving farther away. "Let me reach him before they do." The drain passage ended beneath a rusted grate behind the kitchens. Pip lifted it with both hands while Miriam pushed from below, and the metal rose just far enough for them to crawl through one at a time. Madame Pomfrey came last, breathing hard. Soot had settled into the lines of her face, and one sleeve was wet to the elbow. She set the grate back into place and listened towards the kitchen doors. House-elves crossed the stone floor carrying buckets and cloths, and none looked towards them. Water ran in thin streams between the flagstones, carrying flour, ash, and small black pieces of burned rope. "The upper room," Miriam said. Pip pointed towards the far pantry, behind the cold shelf. They moved through the kitchen separately. Madame Pomfrey took a tray from a work table and covered it with a cloth. Miriam carried an empty bucket. Pip joined the line of elves hauling water towards the flour store, then slipped away when the others turned the corner. Beside a wall of barrels stood the cold shelf, its upper racks holding salted meat and wheels of hard cheese beneath preservation charms. Miriam waited until 2 elves passed, then reached behind the lowest shelf and found a narrow iron ring. It would not move. Pip came beside her and pulled with both hands. The ring lifted, and a small door swung open where it had sat flat in the wall. Behind it, a stone ladder climbed through a shaft, no wider than a chimney. "Not the dumbwaiter," Miriam said. Pip shook his head. "Old service way," he told her, and when she asked whether it reached the same room, he only nodded. Madame Pomfrey looked upwards. "He may have fallen after leaving the platform." Miriam set the bucket down and stepped into the shaft. The stone rungs were damp under her hands. Her injured finger had stiffened during the climb down, and each time she closed it around the iron, the pain ran up into her wrist. She climbed with her weight tipped against the wall, listening for any movement above her. Halfway up, the shaft widened around an old wooden landing. The dumbwaiter ropes hung beside it, one burned clean through, the other still swaying a little. A faint smear of blood marked the edge of the upper opening. "Daniel," she whispered. Nothing answered, so she climbed faster. The upper door led her out into a disused serving room. Broken plates lay stacked in wooden crates, and a long table stood beneath a sheet gone gray with dust. Cold stone and old grease, that was the smell of it, and Daniel was gone. She hauled herself through and searched behind the crates. Someone had disturbed the sheet on the table, leaving a handprint pressed into the dust. And near the far wall, a narrow trail led towards another door. Pip's head appeared in the shaft opening. "Is he there?" "No." Behind him, Madame Pomfrey was already climbing after, asking whether the boy could walk. "He shouldn't," Miriam told her. That was not what she had asked, the matron said, but Miriam had already crossed the room and opened the second door. Beyond it lay a corridor. She remembered from her first year, the ceiling sloping low beneath the kitchen stairs, pipes running along one wall towards the great hall. At the end stood the small chamber, where she had once hidden from older students after losing a house point. Its door was open. Daniel sat inside with his back against the wall. He had tied the sheet rope around his injured leg as a brace, and a kitchen knife rested across his knees. Miriam stopped in the doorway. "Where did you get that?" He looked down at the knife. "Table. You could have opened the stitches." "I heard someone in the shaft. I didn't know it was you." Madame Pomfrey knelt and examined the bandage. He had climbed off the platform alone, she noted, and Daniel said there had been nowhere else to go, that the room was on fire. He might have waited, she said, and he didn't answer that. She untied the rope brace. Blood had spread beneath the bandage, but had not reached his shoe. Pip closed the chamber door and pressed his ear to it. Someone is coming. Miriam killed the light in her wand. Footsteps came into the corridor outside, slow and uncertain, and a lantern threw a narrow bar of light beneath the door. Daniel tightened his grip around the knife. A man coughed. She knew the sound before the voice reached her. "Open up," Filch called. No one moved. His keys scraped against the lock. Miriam looked around the chamber, 2 broken chairs, a stack of copper serving trays, a narrow cupboard built into the wall. Daniel could not fit inside it. Madame Pomfrey stood and smoothed her apron. "Let me speak." "No," Miriam said. Another key rattled in the lock. Pip slipped behind the stack of trays. Miriam pulled Daniel upright and moved him behind the door, taking most of his weight against her shoulder, while Madame Pomfrey stayed in the center of the room. The lock turned. Filch opened the door and raised his lantern. His eyes passed over Madame Pomfrey and settled on Miriam. "What are you doing down here?" "Treating her hand," Madame Pomfrey said. He lifted the lantern higher. "At this hour?" "The kitchen's burned." "I heard." He looked at Miriam's hand, where the splinter beneath her nail had bled through the cloth wrapped around it. "Carrows says someone said it." Madame Pomfrey opened the dressing tin. "Then he has answered his own question." Filch frowned. "He says a student was hidden there." Miriam kept her back against the open door, Daniel's breath warm against the fabric between her shoulders. "Did he find one?" she asked. Filch's gaze shifted towards the space behind the door, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then Mrs. Norris appeared in the corridor. The cat stopped at the threshold, her yellow eyes fixed on the lower edge of Daniel's robe, visible beside Miriam's shoe. Filch followed her stare. Miriam lowered the bucket she still carried and set it down directly in the doorway. Water tipped across the floor and spread around Mrs. Norris's paws, and the cat sprang backwards with a hiss. "Clumsy girl," Filch said. Madame Pomfrey stepped forward and caught Miriam's injured hand. "Quite." He moved aside to let the water pass. His lantern light traveled once more across the chamber and stopped on the dark smear near Daniel's shoe. He rubbed at it with the toe of his boot. "Kitchen grease," he said. Then he took Mrs. Norris beneath one arm and closed the door behind him. The key did not turn in the lock. Miriam waited until his footsteps faded before she let herself breathe again, and Daniel slowly released the knife. "Did he know?" Pip asked. Madame Pomfrey wrapped Miriam's hand with clean gauze. "He knew there was grease on the floor." Nobody said anything after that. Outside, Filch dragged an empty crate across the corridor and left it against the door. The crate stayed where it was until the kitchens began preparing breakfast. Miriam listened to knives striking boards, ovens opening, the low movement of house-elves beneath the floor. No one tried the handle. Madame Pomfrey changed Daniel's dressing again. The stitches had held, though the skin around them had swollen. She touched 2 fingers to his ankle and waited. Could he feel that? She asked, and that. "Yes," he said each time, until she moved to a third place and he flinched before her fingers reached it. The matron looked at Miriam. He needs a proper bed. There is one here. There is a floor. Daniel pulled the loose sleeve down over his hand. The floor is safer. A bell rang above the kitchens, and benches moved in the great hall. Morning count had begun. Pip slipped out through the service shaft to find food and news, and Miriam settled beside the door with her patrol list across her knees. The paper had dried into stiff folds. Beside Selwyn's name in the fourth floor section, someone had added a small ink mark that had not been there before. A circle crossed once through the middle. Madame Pomfrey saw it. What does that mean? He was called for questioning. They used it on the Christmas lists. How do you know? The matron began, but Daniel was already looking towards the door. Because of the flower store, he asked. Because he coughed, Miriam said. He should have let her find us, Daniel said, and Miriam folded the list and told him he did not. That might be exactly what they would ask him. Above them, the great hall doors opened. Students filed out in uneven groups, their footsteps crossing the corridor ceiling. Electo Carrows' voice followed, calling 2 names and ordering the rest onto lessons. Selwyn's was one of them. Daniel heard it too and lowered his head until his forehead rested against the wall. Pip came back through the service shaft with a heel of bread, 2 apples, and a small folded note. One of his eyes had swollen almost shut. He gave the food to Daniel and held the note out to Miriam. From whom? Pip found it beneath the hospital door. The writing was Madame Pomfrey's, though the matron sat 3 feet away. Miriam unfolded the scrap. Search of lower rooms at second bell. Prefect Vale to report to Great Hall. All House-elves confined after breakfast. Madame Pomfrey read over her shoulder. She'd written that last night, she said. Before the fire, before they left. Then someone had moved it. Pip glanced up at the ceiling. Second bell soon. Miriam tore the note into narrow strips and dropped them into the cold remains of the lamp. They want me out of the way. Daniel stopped eating. Madame Pomfrey repacked the dressing tin. Miriam would report. She said no, she must. They would search here. And they would search harder, the matron told her, if she did not appear. Miriam looked at the chamber walls. No second door, only the service shaft and the corridor blocked by Filch's crate. If the house-elves were confined, Pip could not move freely, and Daniel could not climb again. The first bell sounded. Pip gathered the crumbs from the floor with one hand. There is another place. Where? Miriam asked. The elf pointed upwards, inside the great hall wall. Madame Pomfrey stared at him. There is no room inside that wall. Small room. For plates before tables fill. Can he reach it from here? Through warming pipes. Daniel looked at the narrow pipes running along the corridor outside. I will not fit. Pip fits. You are half my size. Pip lowered his head, then lifted it again. There is a door from behind the staff table. Miriam understood before the elf had finished. During breakfast, tables full, feet everywhere, no one looks low. Madame Pomfrey pressed the lid back onto the tin and set it down. He could not cross the kitchen passage, she said. He can if the count is still running. And if it is not? Miriam was already on her feet. Then I make them look elsewhere. The second bell had begun before she reached the shaft. She climbed down alone. Pip staying above with Daniel, while Madame Pomfrey went back towards the hospital wing along the drain passage. At the bottom, she washed the soot from her face in a basin, then straightened her prefect badge until it sat square. Students had been cleared from the kitchens, but the House-elves stood in rows beside the ovens, and Alecto walked between them with a narrow switch tapping against her palm. By the outer door waited Filch, a ring of keys in one hand. His eyes found Miriam's. "Great Hall," he said. She crossed without once glancing towards the cold shelf. Behind her, Alecto was already ordering the elves to turn out their sacks and their clothing. The great hall stood nearly empty, a few students left at the tables under guard. Among them, the two Ravenclaw girls she had led off punishment. On the stone before the staff table knelt Selwyn, one side of his face bruised, his hands tied behind him with silver cord. Amicus Carrows stood over him. "There she is." Miriam stopped at the end of the Hufflepuff table. Carrow held up a length of white braid blackened along one edge, part of the rope from the flower store. "Recognize this?" "No, Professor." Selwyn kept his eyes on the floor. Carrow came a few steps closer and said it had been made from hospital linen. Still Miriam said nothing. Her matron, he went on, recorded 6 sheets missing. "She loses supplies." "She says you took them." Miriam fixed on Carrow's collar rather than his face. "Then you should ask her why." "I did." The silver cord around Selwyn's wrists drew tight, and his shoulders jerked back. Carrow turned to him and told him to say what he had already said. The boy's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Amicus drew his wand and pressed it up beneath the jaw. "The passage." Selwyn looked at Miriam then, his bruised eye barely open. "There's a room below the hospital wing," he said. The hall was quiet. "What else?" He swallowed. "It leads towards the kitchens." Miriam's hand closed over the edge of the table. "Where in the kitchens?" Selwyn only stared at her until Carrow moved the wand higher. "The flower store," he whispered. From the entrance came Alecto's voice. "The store is empty." Amicus looked around towards her, and in that moment, behind the staff table, a small panel opened at floor level. Pip's thin hand showed for an instant and withdrew. Miriam stepped forward and let the patrol list slip from her pocket, every loose page scattering across the floor. The Ravenclaw girls moved first, bending to gather them. Chairs scraped, and one of the guards shouted for everyone to hold still. In the confusion, Daniel's hand reached through the low panel behind the staff table and caught its edge. Miriam dropped to one knee among the papers. Carrows struck her across the face with the back of his hand. The hall tilted and blood filled her mouth, and when she looked up again, the panel was closed. Selwyn stayed where he was, breathing through his nose. Miriam gathered the last sheet and got to her feet. Amicus wiped his hand on her shoulder. "Search the wall," he said. The search began behind the staff table, 2 older students dragging the chairs aside while Alecto ran her wand along the stone. The small panel did not open. Its edges had gone into the wall entirely, leaving only an uneven patch where the mortar had darkened with age. "Again," Amicus said. She repeated the spell. Nothing moved. Miriam waited beside the Hufflepuff table, blood drying at the corner of her mouth. Selwyn was still on his knees. The silver cord had cut into both wrists, and a thin red line ran out from beneath one cuff. "Where's the catch?" Amicus asked. Selwyn shook his head. He had said there was a passage, Amicus reminded him. "There is." "Then open it." "I don't know how." Amicus kicked the back of his leg. With his hands tied, Selwyn pitched forward and caught himself on one shoulder, and not one of the students moved to help him. Alecto turned from the wall. "Bring the elf?" Pip was still in the kitchens. Miriam looked from the staff table to the doors. 3 ordinary exits, all guarded, and behind the dais, the smaller service door that led straight to the kitchen stair. Amicus caught her glance. "You," he said, and when she lowered her eyes, "go and fetch the elf who serves the hospital wing." "There are several." "The one with the bent ear." She did not move. Amicus stepped closer, close enough now that she could hear him breathe. "Do you need the name?" "No, Professor." "Then go." Miriam crossed the hall, her shoes far too loud against the stone. At the service door, one of the guards lifted the latch, but kept his hand on the handle. "Bring him straight back," Alecto said. The passage beyond lay empty. Miriam walked on until the great hall had shut behind her, then stopped beside the first turning where a trail of flour marked the floor. Near the skirting board, small bare footprints leading towards the kitchens. She rubbed them away with the side of her shoe. Pip was behind the cold shelf when she came in, one hand pressed over his injured eye, the other holding the iron ring to the service shaft. "Where is Daniel?" "Inside the wall." "Can he move farther?" Pip nodded. "There is a cupboard behind the old flagstones." "Can it be opened from the hall?" "Only if Pip opens." "They are sending for you." His fingers tightened around the ring. He looked towards the great hall wall and said Daniel could not open the cupboard alone. Miriam glanced along the rows of House-elves. Alecto had left 2 Slytherin prefects to watch them, both near the ovens, one speaking to the head kitchen elf, the other counting spoons into a wooden box. "Take off the sacking," Miriam said. Pip stared at her. "Give it to me." He untied the garment from his waist. The skin beneath was marked with old burns and fresh red lines from the switch. Miriam folded the cloth and tucked it under her robe. "What is Miss doing?" "Go through the shaft." "They will know." "They already know." Pip looked again towards the wall. Daniel could not manage the cupboard by himself, he said. "Then stay with him." "What will Miss say?" Miriam picked up the empty bucket beside the shelf. "That I could not find you?" His ears drew back. "They will hurt Miss?" "They may." Still he did not move. Miriam bent down until their faces were level. "Close the shaft after you." Nothing more was said. Pip climbed through the opening and lowered himself into the dark. She replaced the shelf, crossed to the nearest water barrel, and filled the bucket halfway. One of the prefects noticed her. "Where's the elf?" "I haven't found him." "He was here." "He is not now." The boy looked to the other prefect. Neither of them wanted to leave the spoon count. Miriam carried the bucket back towards the hall. Amicus was waiting inside the service passage. He took the bucket from her and tipped the water across the floor. "Where is he?" "I don't know." "You were told to fetch him?" He has left the kitchens. House-elves do not leave when confined. She said nothing. Amicus caught the front of her robe and pulled her closer, and as he did, the hidden sacking shifted beneath the fabric. His hand moved down and found it. Slowly he drew the garment out. The passage narrowed around them. "What is this?" Miriam looked at the torn brown cloth in his hand. Cleaning rag. He struck her again, and this time she went into the wall, the back of her head meeting stone, the service lamps, blurring into two pale rows. She kept upright only by holding the edge of the door frame. Amicus pressed the sacking beneath her nose. "It belonged to the elf," he said. "Yes." "Where is he?" "I sent him away." "To do what?" "Dispose of the burned linen." "Where?" "The ash pits." He watched her face for any flicker of movement. Miriam tasted blood again and kept her eyes down. Alecto came into the passage behind him. The wall is hollow. Amicus did not let go of Miriam's robe. How much? 6 feet across, perhaps more. There's no opening. There was. Then it has been sealed? Amicus looked at the sacking, then back at Miriam. By an elf? Alecto smiled without any warmth in it. Bring her. They went back to the great hall. Selwyn had been dragged nearer the wall. The 2 Ravenclaw girls were gone now, and the last of the students with them. Only the guards remained. Alecto set Miriam in front of the dark patch of mortar. "Open it." "I cannot." Amicus held up Pip's sacking, turning it so the frayed edge caught the light. "You sent him into the passage." "No." "Then why do you have this?" Miriam wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of one hand and said the boy had dropped it. "Where?" Amicus wanted to know. "In the kitchens," she told him. "You are becoming tiresome," Alecto said and raised her wand. The first curse struck Miriam's right hand. Pain closed around the fingers and forced them inward. She fell against the staff table, knocking one chair onto its side, and the prefect badge tore loose from her robe and skidded across the floor. "Open it." She tried to straighten her hand. The fingers would not obey. "I don't know how." The second curse caught her wrist. Behind her she heard Selwyn move, then the silver cord tightening as a guard hauled him back, and Amicus stepped over the fallen chair. "Ask the wall nicely." No one answered. Inside the passage, something knocked once. Alecto turned. It came again, farther along. This time, a dull tap that traveled through the stone behind the staff table and then moved towards the northern wall. Amicus raised his wand and followed it. Another knock sounded near the doors. "It is moving," Alecto said. The guards spread out along the wall, and Selwyn lifted his head. Miriam understood then that Pip was leading them away from the cupboard. The tapping went on around the hall, slow enough to be followed, and each time the Carrows reached one place, it came again several yards beyond them. Amicus pointed to the service door. "Cut it off from the kitchens." One guard ran. Alecto followed the sound towards the entrance hall, the second guard dragging Selwyn after her by the cord, and for a moment Miriam was left beside the staff table with Amicus alone. He looked down at her injured hand. "You will stay here," he said, and then he too went after the others. Miriam waited until the doors closed. Her wand had fallen beneath the table. She reached for it with her left hand and crawled behind the dais. The small panel stayed hidden, but a faint draft touched her face near the floor. She placed her palm against the mortar, and 3 taps answered from inside. Feeling for the edge, she pressed where the stone was coldest, and the panel opened just wide enough for Pip's good eye to appear. "Daniel," she whispered. "Safe." "Stay there." The elf looked at her hand. "Close it," she said, and he obeyed. She picked her prefect badge up off the floor. The pin had bent, and one corner was marked with blood. She pushed it into the gap between the panel and the stone, forcing the metal deep until the hidden catch jammed. Footsteps returned from the entrance hall. She settled against the wall with her damaged hand in her lap, and behind her the panel would no longer open from either side. Amicus returned first, breathing hard from the search, Alecto behind him with 2 guards and Selwyn between them. The tapping had stopped somewhere near the entrance hall, and none of them had found an opening. Miriam had not moved from behind the staff table. Her right hand had swollen across the knuckles, the fingers curled tightly into the palm, and the blood on her badge had dried where it was wedged inside the hidden panel. "Where's your wand?" Amicus asked. She looked beneath the table. "There." He picked it up and held it away from her. "What did you do?" "Nothing." Alecto crossed to the wall and pressed her wand against the dark mortar. The spell spread over the stones in a thin white line, outlining the hidden panel at last, and she smiled and touched the center. It did not open. "Again," Amicus said. The second spell struck harder. Dust fell from the joints, but the panel held. The bent prefect badge scraped inside the catch and stayed fixed. "What is blocking it?" Alecto said, looking at Miriam. "I don't know." Amicus crouched beside her and seized the injured wrist. Miriam's shoulder struck the wall as he pulled the hand towards him, and still the curled fingers would not straighten. "You were here alone," he said. "Yes, you had a wand. It was under the table." He twisted the wrist. She drew one breath through her nose and kept her eyes on the flagstones. "She dropped it when you cursed her," Selwyn said from behind them. Amicus turned. The guard holding Selwyn tightened the cord around his arms, and he staggered but did not look away. "I saw it. You have seen too much tonight," Alecto said, and raised her wand. Selwyn lowered his head before the curse struck. It knocked him against the nearest bench, where he stayed folded on the floor. The sound inside the wall did not change. Amicus released Miriam and stood. "Break it open." The guard fetched an iron poker from the hearth, and Alecto directed them to the lower seam, where the old mortar had begun to crumble. Each blow traveled through the wall and into Miriam's back. Inside the passage, Pip and Daniel would hear every strike. She watched the poker rise and fall. The first stone loosened, the second cracked through the center. At the great hall doors, Professor Sinistra appeared. She carried the same bundle of astronomy charts as before, and her gaze moved over Selwyn, Miriam, and the damaged wall. Then she looked at the ceiling. "The 7th-year examination begins in 4 minutes, she said. Alecto did not turn. "Cancel it." The headmaster approved the timetable. "Then tell him it has changed." Sinistra set the charts on the end of the Ravenclaw table. "He is observing." Amicus looked towards the staff entrance where Professor Snape stood in the doorway. No one had heard him arrive. His black robes hung still around him, and his face showed nothing as he took in the broken stones, the the overturned chair, Miriam's injured hand. "What is this?" he asked. Alecto lowered her wand and said it was a concealed chamber containing what he asked. They had not opened it. "Then you do not know." Amicus pointed towards Miriam. She hid a wanted student. Snape's eyes rested on her a moment. "Did she?" "The elf led us here." "Which elf?" "The hospital one." "Where is it?" Amicus did not answer. Snape walked to the damaged wall and examined the outline left by Alecto's spell, touched one finger to the cracked mortar, then looked towards the broken poker in the guard's hands. "This is a warming duct." "It moves," Alecto replied. "So do warming ducts." There was tapping inside it. Pipes contract. Amicus stepped closer. "A boy is hiding in the castle." "Several hundred boys are hiding in the castle whenever they ought to be in lessons." No one smiled. Snape turned toward Sinistra. "Begin the examination." Alecto's mouth tightened. "We are not finished. You are standing in the Great Hall during scheduled instruction. We have authority to search, and I have authority over the use of this room." Amicus looked at the guards. Neither lifted the poker again. Outside the doors, students had begun to gather, their voices low, and the corridor filled quickly. The seventh years came in by pairs, saw Selwyn on the floor and Miriam against the wall, and took their places without speaking. Snape moved behind the staff table, his robe brushing the hidden panel. For 1 second his eyes dropped to the narrow smear of blood beside the mortar. Whether he saw the bent badge inside the catch, Miriam could not tell. He stepped away. "Remove them," he said. The guards lifted Selwyn first. He could stand, though one leg dragged. Amicus took Miriam by the uninjured arm and pulled her upright, and her damaged hand stayed pressed against her stomach. "Where?" Alecto asked. Snape opened the examination ledger. "The West Dungeon." Miriam looked towards the wall. "The cells?" Amicus said. "The storage chamber beside them." Alecto seemed disappointed. "For how long?" "Until I decide what interferes least with the school day." The great hall filled around them. Quills were placed on desks, parchment rustled, and no one looked directly at Miriam as she was taken towards the doors. At the threshold, Professor Sinistra handed out the first examination paper. Her fingers paused over one sheet, then folded its lower corner. A small mark had been drawn there in chalk. 2 short white lines, one beneath the other. Miriam saw it before Amicus pushed her into the corridor. Behind the staff table, the damaged wall remained closed. The storage chamber beside the West Dungeon held broken desks, split cauldrons, and a row of iron bedsteads without mattresses. Amicus pushed Miriam inside and locked the door. Selwyn was taken farther down the passage where another bolt closed behind him. No window opened to the grounds. A narrow vent near the ceiling carried air from the corridor and the distant sound of students changing lessons. And Miriam sat on an overturned crate and rested her right hand in her lap. The swelling had reached her wrist now, and 2 fingers stayed fixed against the palm. She tried to move them, and the pain came clean and immediate. Filch brought a cup of water and a piece of bread at midday, setting them just inside the door, without stepping through. "Matron's been told," he said. Miriam looked up and asked whether she would come. He adjusted the keys at his belt, said it depended on who was asking, and closed the door again. One edge of the bread was stale, the other soft. She ate half and pushed the rest beneath the nearest bed frame, then drank slowly, saving a little water in the bottom of the cup. Later, footsteps stopped outside Selwyn's room. A question was put too quietly to make out, then a pause, then the sound of something striking wood. Miriam counted the stones in the wall until the footsteps moved away again. Afternoon dragged the light beneath her door from one shade to another. Once, a shadow stayed there for several minutes together. No key went into the lock. Near evening, something small scratched inside the vent. She stood on the crate and reached up with her left hand and found a folded strip of linen pushed between the bars. She worked it free. 3 words, written in green potion ink. Upper room, safe. No name beneath them. She tore the message into pieces and soaked them in what water was left. The ink loosened at once. She rubbed the wet linen between her fingers until the words were gone, then fed the scraps through a crack in the floor. After supper, the corridor went quiet. Somewhere above, the castle settled into its night sounds. Pipes knocking, doors closing, a suit of armor shifting in an empty passage. From Selwyn's room came a single cough. She tapped twice against the wall. After a moment, he tapped once in reply. The lock opened after midnight. Madame Pomfrey came in with a covered lamp and her medical case. Filch, behind her, looking down towards the far end of the corridor. "You have 10 minutes," he said. She closed the door, set the lamp on the floor, and examined the hand without asking how it had happened. "2 fingers are dislocated," she said. "The wrist is cracked." Miriam asked if she could fix it. "Some of it," the matron said, and then worked in silence. The first finger went back with a dull movement that narrowed Miriam's vision to a point. The second would not straighten fully. Madame Pomfrey wrapped wrist and hand in stiff bandages, leaving only the thumb and forefinger free, and fastened the last fold with a small brass clip. "Daniel?" Miriam asked. "Above the kitchens." She asked after Pip and was told he was with him. She asked about food and was told there was enough for tonight. Miriam nodded. The matron packed away the splint. Before she closed the case, she took out Miriam's bent prefect badge, dried mortar along one edge, a dark stain across the badger. "They found it when they opened the duct after lessons," she said. Miriam looked at it and asked whether they had opened the passage. 6 feet of wall, the matron said. Nobody there. She set the badge down beside the lamp. The pin had snapped away completely. "Keep it," Miriam said. "I cannot return it to the school." "I know." The matron put it into her pocket. At the door, Filch gave a quiet warning, and Madame Pomfrey lifted the lamp and went out without looking back. The lock turned again. Before dawn, boots came through the dungeon corridor. They stopped first at Selwyn's door, then at hers. She stood beside the entrance with her bandaged hand held close against her body. The bolt on the outer side scraped once but did not lift. A key tried the lock and failed. The person outside tried another, then struck the door with the flat of a hand. Filch's voice answered from farther down the passage. "A warped frame," he called. "Been stickin' all winter." The key ring moved away. She waited until the footsteps had passed. Near the bottom hinge, the door had shifted inward by less than an inch. Lowering herself to the floor, she found a loose iron bracket beneath one of the bedsteads and, with her left hand, worked it into the gap between door and stone, the metal held. Beyond the wall, morning was starting somewhere in the castle. Pipes shuddered above the ceiling. A bell sounded once. Miriam sat with her back against the door and her injured hand across her knees, the iron bracket wedged fast beneath the frame. The student was moved on within the week, quietly, to somewhere the regime's lists did not reach. No medal was ever struck for that night, and the people who made it possible would have been alarmed by the suggestion. They had simply decided a child's life was worth the risk to their own, and then said nothing about it to anyone for a very long time.